that. This afternoon's speaker will take us out the rest of the day. Jamie Massengill. He is involved in sleep medicine, pain management, and palliative care. Is that correct? Has kind of a specialty practice up in Edmond. And he graduated from OU, a PA program in 2003. I met him on the stairway coming down with my arm full of stuff. Didn't even recognize him because I don't remember anybody anymore. I kind of get out there and I just said, "Hey, how you doing?" He came back and said, "I'm Jamie Massengill." I felt like such an idiot because I'm talking to you. My dialogue has been all via email for a while. We've just been kind of connecting dots. But we're very glad to have him here and talk to us today, and I'm sure it will be some interesting presentation. I kind of already looked at the slides, they look pretty interesting. So I'm going to just let him take it away, and at the point that we have all of your SP evaluations, we'll bring those and give those to you. So they're being worked on right now. Okay? Thank you so much.
You didn't recognize me because I've gotten old and a lot of gray hair since
Now
then.
here it is, Jay. You know, you probably look just as youthful as ever, but I can say that my vision is bad. I just saw some blurry.
Right. So last time we were together, which was just a few weeks ago, you all were in neurology, and we've successfully passed that, right? Dan didn't beat you up too bad. So when we revisit a lot of that, it wasn't necessarily done purposefully that we would piggyback some of that, but we're going to talk a lot about neurobiology. And so when I say the terms locus coeruleus and nucleus accumbens and dorsal raphe nucleus and ventral tegmental area, you're all going to moan and groan and say, "Oh, we were done with all that stuff." But no, we're going to revisit all of it again today because it's so important. In years past, I believe that the substance use disorders lecture, abuse, misuse, diversion, drug liking, all of that kind of stuff. I've looked through the old lectures and truthfully I didn't like any of them because it's way too A, elementary, and B, I think you really need to understand the neurobiology of addiction to understand why it happens and how we actually treat it. And I'm just going to give you a little insight. For the last 8 years, I've been on the NCCPA test writing committee for the Certificate of Added Qualification in Psychiatry. So every single question on that Certificate of Added Qualification exam, I have either written or seen. And I can tell you that there's a fair bit of emphasis on substance use and substance use disorders. And so it's important. I'm not going to really go through the patient presents as blah, 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 blah if they're cocaine intoxicated. You're going to work through that in the pharmacology world, but I'm going to give you the neurobiology or the underpinnings of all that. Then in parts 2 and 3 this afternoon, we may be here till 8 o'clock at night because we're going to do the fun stuff after this. And we're going to actually do sleep medicine, and that's one of my passions. And so we're going to do actually 2 separate lectures on sleep, and we'll go through major sleep-related disorders, and we'll also talk a lot about sort of neurobiology, neurophysiology, neurochemistry as it pertains to sleep because it's really, really important to understand. When we were together last, where are my 2 Garth Brooksers? Yes, it was awesome, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was good.
It was.
It lasted until like 4 in the morning.
You know, so you went to Friday night, I was at Saturday at 3, so. The other thing we talked about was volleyball. Anybody know where the U.S. is currently ranked in the World Grand Prix? Number 2. Number 2. So if you get a chance and it's on TV, you watch them. Because how many of you are here are from at least the Edmond or North Oklahoma City area? Okay. So there is a young lady who plays on our Olympic volleyball team now, who played club volleyball in Edmond. And then she went to Penn State, and she was on the national championship team for Penn State. And she is one of the setters on our Olympic team now. And so it's just interesting to see a kid that, well, she's not a kid anymore, but a player that I've watched grow up in club volleyball where my kids play, and then go on and play collegiately, and then now in the ranks of the Olympic world. So it's pretty neat to see. So neurobiology of addiction. This whole presentation is adapted from a wonderful slide deck from the University of Sydney I tried to take all of the OUs out of behavior because they like to do things a little differently, but you know, there may be some terms that are a little off, but this lecture is so good that instead of me reinventing the wheel, I kind of walked it through with this particular lecture I have on hand. So we're going to spend a lot of time with neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, neurochemistry of addiction, so that you really understand how these behaviors develop, how they're rewarded, and what are the underlying neurochemistry and neurobiological pathways. And then we'll talk through some of the studies that have been done, and it may be some moaners and groaners that going back to 1950 rat studies, but those were really the foundation of what we understand about the neurobiology of addiction. And so we'll look through that, and then we'll talk a little bit about different substances, and then we'll talk a little bit about the state of Oklahoma. It's not in the slide deck, but it's kind of important. So really definition-wise, you know, you can do some wordsmithing to try to figure out the difference between abuse, misuse, diversion, drug liking, addiction, habituation, so on and so forth. But for this particular lecture, this is the definition that we're going to use of addiction, a condition where we may ingest a substance or engage in some sort of activity or behavior. It's a pleasurable thing for the most part, or at least it sends information through the pleasure centers of the brain. But continuation of that behavior interferes then with our day-to-day activities or our relationships or our ability to function in the world, and that's when it becomes a pathology. So you're right now working through psychiatry, so you've been introduced to the AXIS system, correct? So AXIS 1 are all of your major disorders in the DSM with the exception of personality disorders, right? Personality disorders are AXIS 2, AXIS 3 are major medical conditions, AXIS 4, social, psychosocial related issues, and AXIS 5, global assessment of functioning. Does that all sound familiar? No?
We didn't learn like axis numbers.
Oh, okay, this is important then, because if you ever do a psychiatric evaluation, and you're gonna have to do that whenever you do your psych rotations, you're gonna have to deal with the axes, and there are 5 of them. So AXIS 1 again is all of your major disorders in the DSM that are not personality disorders. That's an easy way to think about it. So that's all your mood disorders, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorders, schizophrenic, those kinds of disorders, bipolar disorder, and so forth. AXIS 2 are personality disorders. I will absolutely tell you I can't stand to deal with standardized questions on personality disorders, because what's the treatment for a personality disorder? Therapy. There's no medication. And so they're really difficult questions to write, and all of the questions become, patient is blah, 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 blah. Which of the personality disorders might they have? And so it's all memorization, and I can't stand that, but those are AXIS 2. AXIS 3 are medical conditions. So that's anything that might have that is a medical condition. AXIS 4 are social and psychosocial related stressors, and or those also can be positive things, such as if they have a good social support network or these types of things. That goes on AXIS 4. And then AXIS 5 is what is known as the Global Assessment of Function, or the GAF, and it's a scale. And I will tell you, even lots of physicians practicing in psychiatry will tell you GAF is really kind of a shot in the dark, made up number that you just kind of look at the scale and say, I think they've got a GAF of blah blah. And when they get out of inpatient, they should have a better GAF when it started. But you're gonna work through a little understanding of GAF, and depending on your psychiatry rotation, you're gonna be responsible potentially for doing admit H&P, and you're gonna have to at least understand what goes on each of those axes. So most of what we'll talk about from, say, the neurobiology of addiction side, these are now termed in the newest version of DSM as substance use disorders, and that's sort of new nomenclature. It's all of the same stuff that was in there before, but they've changed the name a little bit, and they're now considered substance use disorders. So when we look at addiction based on the definition that we've been given, there are multiple factors in play. It's not just that there are social factors that have led somebody to develop abuse, misuse, or addiction. It's not just their genetics, their biological factors, and it's not just things that develop within the person themselves. It's the combination of each of those, and you'll see as we work through, especially in animal studies, how it's been readily displayed that environmental factors can play just as much of a role as a person engaging or an animal engaging in a certain behavior that end up developing addiction tendencies, and then genetics as well. So these things are all fun areas that you've talked about up to this point. So main areas that we have to think about in the neurobiology of addiction or substance use disorders is frontal cortex. So this is frontal, orbital frontal, prefrontal cortex. The easiest way to think about that area is your yes, no, your start, stop. This is your choosing an appropriate versus inappropriate behavior, so judgment, logic, those types of things. Amygdala, I think I talked about that quite a bit a few weeks ago when we look at processing of emotions and tagging memories, especially related to fear. And then thalamus, you've spent a lot of time with thalamus, temperature regulation, opiate binding, and there's a lot of stuff. The thalamus, you could spend hours and hours and days on taking it apart. The ventral tegmental area we'll talk about quite a bit because it involves a fair bit of reward pathway and dopaminergic pathways, and you're going to find that the key term in all of this is going to be dopamine, 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 because that's going to be your major reward chemical, although we're going to find that a lot of other things will play into those reward pathways. Hippocampus, so you're dealing with memory there. Locus coeruleus, obviously we're dealing with neurotransmitter systems from the locus coeruleus. Nucleus accumbens, I don't think it's on this slide, it's on another. You're obviously dealing with neurochemicals there we'll talk through as well. So your dopamine pathways, you're basically looking at major pathways that are going to innervate the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex from nucleus accumbens. You've got the hippocampal involvement, the ventral tegmental area, as well as information from the dorsal raphe nucleus. I'm not going to map all of those, but those are major areas that you need to be aware of, that from your neurology training with Dan and the other experts that lectured you, of how each of those things may feedback upon one another and or be involved with one another for regulating behavior. So we know that other neurochemicals are involved with the pleasure pathway. So it's not just dopamine, and it's not just norepinephrine, and it's not just GABA or glutamate or glycine or aspartate or serotonin. But serotonin is also a major neurochemical when we have to deal with mood, obviously, as you're going to work through Dr. Batassi's discussions on treatment of mood disorders and so forth, and looking at the pharmacology behind antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. A lot of them tap into serotonergic pathways, noradrenergic pathways. So serotonin, we're really dealing mostly with mood, but it also has relationships to cognition, sleep, memory. And again, they're innervating very similar areas. And there'll be a slide in a few minutes. It's going to be very complicated, but it's very telling at how complicated the good Lord made our brain, because there are connections that go here and there and everywhere, but they all perform very specific and integral parts to our behavior. So the reward pathway is just basically an axonal network in the brain that involves multiple neurochemical innervations to multiple different nuclei and areas of the brain. But that pathway is activated by certain things. And so this pathway is activated by things that we require, food and water, that are integral for our species preservation, sexual activity, or other activities that can be or evoke pleasurable responses. So skydiving or riding roller coasters, or put any number of things in there. Bull riding, going to Garth Brooks concerts, you know, whatever it may be. And exercise also is a very potent activator of the reward pathway of the pleasure centers of the brain. So when we look at the neurochemical involvement, what we can find is that there's not just one particular chemical that's involved, but multiple, and they all have relationships with one another. So when we look through each of these, they all play a little different role. So your dopaminergic side of the pathway is really dealing with pleasure and euphoria mood. Some find dexterity and motor function. Your serotonergic side, like we talked about, is mood and dealing with cognition, anxiety. Some impulsivity, although you're doing impulsivity has a lot to do with orbitofrontal, prefrontal cortex innervations from noradrenergic innervation, and obviously that's how stimulants may work in impulsive children and or adults. Cannabinoids, we could go down the road of yay cannabis or no cannabis, and I'm not here to argue whether or not it should be used for certain medicinal purposes and so forth. We just know that there is some science to deal with cannabinoids in the brain. It is science that is lacking a lot of information, and depending on which researchers do the study, you can tell which way they're bent. And so the pro-cannabis researchers are obviously the ones that probably at some point engaged or continue to engage in the use of the substance, and so their research bends it on the pro side, and then you have some centrists on just merely looking at what is the role of cannabinoids in mood and pain and so forth, and then you have the others that are purely against cannabinoids, and their research obviously has a bend to it. But we do know there are cannabinoid receptors that really deal with pain, appetite, some memory, and then your endogenous opioids, your endorphins and kephalins, you're dealing with mainly mood, mainly pain. Although opiates do have some relationship to mood as well. And we're not going to break down mu, kappa, delta, and what each receptor does. That's just way more detailed than what we need to do here. So where are the areas, what are the pathways involved with each of those? Dopamine, serotonin, cannabinoids, opiates. Well, here we go. So dopamine, your main areas are your ventral tegmental area, your nucleus accumbens, your GABA receptors, your amygdala, and your opioid peptides, nucleus accumbens, amygdala, ventral tegmental area, glutamate, nucleus accumbens. So there's one big piece up there that keeps coming up over and over and over and over, and that's your nucleus accumbens. So very, very, very important area when we look at this whole reward pathway. And if you notice, multiple neurochemicals have some sort of activity or are generated within that particular small area of the brain, and it's for a specific reason to deal with our reward pathways. So why do you think it is that this reward pathway is in an older part of the brain? If you think through primitive brain and moving forward, why is it reward pathways are in an older part of the brain?
Preserve species.
Species preservation. So the bee that finds pollen and brings it back to the hive, A, is going to have some memory of where they found that pollen, and B, they're going to socially interact with other bees to take them there to bring back more. Okay? So what are they doing? They're preserving their species by doing that. The rat. So the rat finds an old bag of peanuts that fell into the sewer system over here, but not over here. Well, by finding that food source, we're activating that reward center of the brain, and we're interacting with areas that deal with memory and mapping And so what is happening is that we're using very primitive areas of the brain to preserve species, okay? So that's why that we're using older portions of the brain, or more primitive portions of the brain. Here's the other thing. As the brain develops, what is the last thing to really fully develop? Cortex, okay? That's why kids do dumb crap, okay? Their frontal cortices are not fully developed. So would it make more sense that we develop cortex first or primitive brain first for preserving our species? It's a primitive brain, okay? So that's why these areas are in primitive brain, because that's what allows us to preserve our species and learn. And then learned behavior is going to drive protection of that species, okay? So we kind of talked through those things. So the moans and groans of rat research. So I think I told you last time that part of what I did in an old life is I have a graduate degree in biological psychology and neuroscience. So I did a lot of old research, but luckily I didn't have to deal with rats. But rat research is very important because well, they can't file complaints to the human rights organizations and so forth, so, you know, we can use them for things. But there are very, very important findings that come every day in the science of utilizing rodents and other animals. Not that we're torturing them, but we're helping to advance science through that. And these studies were done quite some time ago, but some of the original neurobiology of addiction reward pathway research was done way back in the 50s. And what we found through that is we could self-stimulate, the animal could self-stimulate either with a chemical or electrical impulse in certain areas of the brain to then induce pleasure. How did we know that? Because the animal would continue to do the behavior and at times would replace things such as eating and drinking and other self-care activities with self-stimulation. And so this is the foundational research to understand A, how do we reward ourselves brain-wise, and B, how potent those neurochemicals in those areas of the brains are. So very early studies showed that we could stimulate the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. Okay, so let's go back a little. Here, ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens. Dopamine, opiates, right? Glutamate, okay? So try to remember through those when we look at that. So they're self-stimulating those areas, and they'll continue to do so. So if we have that stimulus that's provided, those animals would narrow their behavior to continue to do one thing, and that was they would override everything else in their little rodent lives to just continue to stimulate that pleasure and reward part of the brain. Now, how do we know that that area is purely responsible for that? Well, we can lesion that area of the brain. So we can go in and we can chemically or we can surgically lesion the ventral tegmental area, and they will no longer want to engage in that behavior. Even animals that were engaging in that behavior, such though they would quit eating and drinking, and it's just push the lever, push the lever, push the lever, surgically lesion that area or chemically lesion that area, and they stop. And so very early foundational research at the ventral tegmental area with dopaminergic pathways, very, very, very important. So we know if we move forward from rat research to more modern research, looking at PET scans and SPECT scans, that there is an uptake in activity in glucose metabolism in the ventral tegmental area to certain things that bring pleasure. So this is not necessarily stimulating that area through chemical or through electrical impulse, But this is taking someone who may have let's say that somebody has a substance use disorder and their drug of choice is crack cocaine. And you show them their pipe, you will see activity light up in the areas of these people's brains. And this is sort of the precursor to, I'm getting revved up because I'm getting ready to, and it's engage in whatever that behavior is. And so we know that certain stimuli that have been conditioned, so a conditioned response, that we can evoke that response without providing the chemical or physical stimulus, but merely by showing them drug paraphernalia, okay? So then now you see how areas of the brain such as the hippocampus, the amygdala, are involved in the whole process. Because right now we are not ingesting a substance that is activating those areas. We are not putting an electrical stimulation that's activating those reward pathways. We are merely showing you a Taco Bell taco, and that area is starting to light up a little bit, okay? It's a conditioned response there. Now, it doesn't have to be a positive response for this to happen. So remember last time we talked about you're going out on your fancy date at the Drake and you get sick on the oysters? So if I show you the oysters from the Drake and you've been sick from that before, you're going to have activity in this reward pathway, but it's a negative feedback. It's the no way, Jack, don't give me that stuff again. But you're still going to see an increase in activity in that area. So the reward pathway is not necessarily using the term reward for the dog sat so I gave it a biscuit. The reward pathway really deals with both positive and negative affectively valent material, okay? So dopamine, released in the nucleus accumbens when we stimulate the area. We know that we can block that. We know that rodents will purposefully try to inject material into that area of the brain because it acts to incentivize that reward pathway. So they will choose substances if you give them multiple levers with different substances. And substance A may merely be saline that does nothing in that area, and substance B may activate the nucleus accumbens, and substance C may be an antagonist. Guess what? They'll try each of those and they'll figure out real quick, B, 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 B. They're not going to do the others. And so we know that this area of the brain can be selectively chosen to do different things by administering different substances and or chemicals. And we know that by you engaging in a pleasurable activity, dopamine is released from this particular area. So we know we can artificially stimulate it and get dopamine to be produced. We know we can artificially block it. And we know we can endogenously provide production of dopamine from nucleus accumbens by engaging in a pleasurable activity that rewards that pathway. So these are just some quick slides on, and I don't expect you to be able to, well, you've got them in front of you, but they're kind of small. These are basically looking at prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens and what is the dose response for the production of dopamine. And so basically what you're going to see in every slide is some of these basic life activities or other activities that may provide activation or pleasure response in that pathway. You see this spike in dopaminergic production from the nucleus accumbens and activating the prefrontal cortex. So food, sex, administration of amphetamine, administration of cocaine, nicotine, ethanol. So all of these substances, pretty well any of the substances of abuse, misuse, whether they be legal or not, they all do one thing, right? We're all activating the same pathway in the brain with the end result being production of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens to activate memory areas of the brain and orbital frontal prefrontal cortex. So, we can have both direct and indirect actions when we look at substance use disorders. And so, certain drugs of abuse will act directly upon receptors in these different areas of the brain. And so they will bind primarily either presynaptically or postsynaptically. They may be an agonist on a postsynaptic receptor. They may be a partial or full antagonist of a reuptake pump, but some of them actually do act directly on pre or postsynaptic neurons to induce the pleasurable response. And so, for example, if we look at cocaine, and I think there's a slide in here in a minute. Cocaine basically, so if we pretend we have two axons here with we got release of dopamine. What happens is that cocaine blocks the reuptake of dopamine, so that dopamine hangs around in the synaptic cleft longer, so that we get more innervation. Okay, and so it is directly responsible for dealing with the dopamine transporters and dopamine reuptake inhibition. And so that means that we're going to have an increased response in that pathway because dopamine's hanging around longer. What's the half-life of cocaine?
4 hours?
Who said short? You all used it, hadn't you? So cocaine's half-life is short. So when we look at urine drug testing for our patients, cocaine is kind of a hard one to catch because somebody would have had to have ingested cocaine within 2 hours for us to catch it because it's in and out. So a smart substance user knows don't use your cocaine 2 hours before you come in and they're going to get drug tested. Now that's different from that's urine. The numbers are a little bit different orally, but not a whole lot. Now you can get into blood and hair follicle testing and the numbers change a little bit there. But for part and parcel, cocaine is in and out of the system pretty quickly. So the reason that cocaine then has such a highly addictive quality is why then? There you go. The response wears off. So then either we A, have to take something else to deal with the withdrawal, which we'll get through in a minute, withdrawal, or you need to reactivate that system because your reward system is saying, I want more of that, and it's only hanging around a short period of time. So those that engage in use of cocaine have to use fairly regularly, or very commonly you see with cocaine use disorders, they have a concomitant polysubstance use disorder of something else that's helping them deal with the withdrawal. So they're either misusing benzodiazepines or alcohol or opiates or whatever it may be, and they're trying to find a balance in their brains with, I've gone 9 million miles an hour when I've crammed cocaine in there, and now I got to figure out how I deal with my brain not having that in there. And that's either keep going 9 million miles an hour and blow your heart up, or find another way by which to deal with the mood lability and other things that go with withdrawal of those substances. Oh, here's the neat little slide here. So, somebody giggled. Who giggled? Is this not the neatest slide you've seen all day?
All day.
All day. See? All day. So what it basically shows is cocaine, there should be a lot of these little yellow, where's Dan's stick? Right here. There should be a lot of these things. I don't know why they didn't put more of them in here. So basically, what you have here is your synaptic cleft and your dopamine receptors, and this is a reuptake pump here. And so what has happened is that we're not allowing dopamine to be taken back up so that it continues to be able to activate postsynaptically. Now, one thing I want you to has Dr. Latassi talked to you all about psychiatric medications yet?
Some.
Some. What have we been through? Speak of.
Schizophrenia.
Okay, so you've been through atypicals, typicals, mood stabilizing agents. Okay?
Lithium.
Huh?
We went through lithium.
Oh, yes. What's the test for, poor man's test for lithium toxicity?
I don't know.
I like this stick, by the way. Poor man's test for lithium toxicity. Any patient you ever see on lithium, have them hold their hands out. Tremor. Okay, that's a poor man's test for lithium toxicity. Any lithium patient, you know, even if you're going to send them to go get blood, how many times have you been to the doctor and they said, oh, we really need to get some blood work done, here's your prescription. Do you always go do that right then? No, so always have them do your poor man's lithium test. So have you talked about this dude right here?
Yes.
You've talked about monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Okay, so here's the beautiful thing. Look what happens. How does dopamine get chewed up? By monoamine oxidase. Okay, so this is the mechanism. You didn't know I was tying all her junk into mine too. This is how dopamine is degraded, and that's how monoamine oxidase substances work for dealing with mood. Again, it's all through the dopaminergic pathway and the serotonergic pathways as well. Because monoamine oxidase not only deals with dopamine, but with serotonin as well. Okay? So, just a little tidbit there, trying to wrap it all together. We didn't plan that, but. So, indirect. We know that we can directly deal with receptors pre and postsynaptically, reuptake and so forth, but we can also modulate the pathway in an indirect fashion. So we know that we can bind to certain types of receptors that will then have a feedback loop onto nucleus accumbens or locus coeruleus to deal with norepinephrine or dopamine and other particular chemicals in the brain. So if we use alcohol for an example, it's binding actually to GABA receptors. And so we know that your dopaminergic activity is going to change in the ventral tegmental area with use of alcohol, but it's because you're using a different mechanism by which to get there. It's an indirect pathway. So this is also an important thing here. Do you all remember when I talked about this? What's the drug?
Namenda?
No.
Oh.
NMDA, it's a receptor.
Yeah, it has something to do with it.
What drug did I talk about a couple weeks ago that is an NMDA drug? Prolongs the QT interval? Methadone! Yay, who said that? You get a prize. Methadone. Okay, so why is this important? Because we're going to get to in a few minutes, how do you treat opiate addiction? One of the ways by which is methadone. So we know that the NMDA receptor then, in a roundabout way, is involved in the pleasure in the pathway. And so it's an indirect way by which we're going to deal with dopamine and the opiate response. But nonetheless, it's a way by which we found in medicine and in science to work through this pathway in an indirect way. So here is the second best slide you will see all day. What this basically shows you is a very complicated representation of direct and indirect reward pathways. And if you look at it, you have all of these great things that interact with one another. And I would encourage you to print this slide out and really kind of take a look at it, because all of your major substances of use or misuse, whether it be nicotine, alcohol, opiates, stimulants, it's going to really help it make sense to you how these interact with different areas of the brain, but it will help you understand why certain chemicals are used to treat certain misuse disorders. So there's a reason why methadone or buprenorphine will work for opiate addiction, but other chemicals are used to deal with other substances of misuse because they're targeting specific pathways in the brain, and these may be direct pathways or they may be indirect pathways through ventral tegmental area, ultimately working through nucleus accumbens. But you can see pretty well any substance of use, or most of the major substances of use or misuse are there, and they don't all work through the same neurochemical channels in the very beginning. So they may work through GABA or opioid receptors or dopamine, but you can see where, you know, cannabis or cannabinoids react directly with nucleus accumbens. But if we're going to deal with nicotine, we're back a little further than that. We're in the ventral tegmental area before we then have the feedback on the nucleus accumbens. And so this is really a great slide to kind of put it all together. Okay, so the slide now put into words. Alcohol, cocaine, nicotine, heroin, they all work through sort of different areas, but a lot of the time it's ending up with ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens. And so most importantly is really realizing that the same areas are involved over and over with the same chemicals over and over, and that becomes important when we look at other disorders even outside of substance use and misuse. So you've talked about schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, correct? Maybe touched on some other psychoses, correct? Okay, so schizophrenia. We have an abnormality in which neurochemical system? Dopamine. Is it not very interesting then that it's very common for schizophrenic patients to have nicotine use disorders and other potential substance abuse disorders? Why? Same pathway, okay? Also, if you look at, in neurology, you all probably talked about Parkinson's and movement disorders. Okay, so Parkinson's is a disorder of which neurochemical system? Dopamine. Now, is it in the same areas of the brain?
No.
No. Same chemical, though. So how do we treat Parkinsonian movement disorders? Give me a couple of drugs. Boo. Give me newer ones. So, Mirapex, Requip. One thing I'll encourage you. The NCCPA, 2 years ago, adopted a no trade name policy. So by the time you all take your certification exam, there probably will be no trade names on the exam, unless the drug is less than 5 years old. But I can tell you from being on the test writing committee, because I sit on both the PANCE and the PANRE committees, that it takes a few years for questions to get onto the exam once we've written them and they go through standardizing processes up. So by that time, most drugs are 5 years old. And we try not to write questions that are so new, because you're in different parts of the country may not have been readily exposed to certain new drugs, and so we try not to do that. I encourage you to learn generic names. Know the trade names. You're gonna. It's funny, in the practice of medicine, most people use trade names unless it's a drug that's been around forever. On the test, you're gonna have to know generic terms. So just know that. So when we look at newer drugs to treat movement disorders, we have pramipexole, which is Mirapex, and ropinirole, which is Requip. So what do? They increase dopamine, right? In a different part of the brain. But what happens when we increase dopamine, because they're not perfect, they're not smart, okay? We really don't have any smart drugs. Meaning that if my big toe hurts and I take a pain medicine, it doesn't know just to go to my big toe, right? So we don't have smart drugs per se for the most part, unless they're radio labeled and we know they're going to thyroid or whatever. But for the most part, most drugs are dumb. And so what happens is that if we start treating, say, a Parkinsonian patient, and we provide them a dopaminergic agonist, and that filters over into the pleasure part of the brain, what can happen? What's one of the side effects of pramipexole or ropinirole? I hope they taught you this.
It's
Impulse control, shoplifting. I can tell you from experience, I've had a patient who was arrested 3 times for shoplifting before she came to see us in sleep medicine. And her main complaint was she had restless leg, and she was on high-dose Mirapex. And so in all of our patients, whether they be sleep patients or pain patients, we go through a very comprehensive social history workup, and that has to do with, have you ever been in jail? Have you ever been arrested? And if so, why? And plus we pull court records on all of our patients. Well, we can see in the last 9 months, this lady's been arrested 3 times for shoplifting. We took her off the Mirapex. Guess how many times she shoplifted? 0. So it really happens. There's a physician here in Oklahoma City who had a malpractice suit brought against him, a sleep medicine physician, for not educating his patients on pathological gambling, which is another impulse control issue, and the use of dopaminergic drugs in treatment of restless leg. They settled it out of court, but he had to admit liability. So it shows you that we may be treating one particular condition with a particular chemical, but come to find out they're not smart, so they're going to filter over into other areas of the brain. Okay? So what can we do in Parkinsonian patients or restless leg patients if we dose them too high? They can get hallucinations or delusions, right? So now you're dealing with the pathology involved in schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. So you see how we may be treating condition A, but the drugs that we're using or the chemicals that we're using will interact with multiple neurochemical pathways, and we may not even be thinking in the back of our mind. We're thinking, I'm dealing with limbic system, hallucinations, delusions in this particular patient, and so I'm going to give them a dopaminergic antagonist, one of the atypical or typical antipsychotic agents. Why is it then a lot of those people have adonia or loss of pleasure and so on and so forth? Because we've completely jacked with the pleasure part of their brain by blocking dopamine. It's not smart. It's not just going to go to one area. It's going to deal globally. So we have to constantly balance risk versus benefit of any medicine that we're using. And you see how important these pathways are and how they interact with one another. Withdrawal. So when we have habitually used a substance or engaged in a particular pleasurable behavior, and we suddenly withdraw that drug or whatever it may be, we abruptly cease doing so, we may induce withdrawal. So withdrawal involves not only mood components, but it also involves behavioral components and neurochemical activation. So whenever we have somebody that's in substance use disorder withdrawal because they have stopped alcohol or benzodiazepines abruptly or opiates or cocaine or methamphetamine or whatever it may be, we're going to have the autonomic nervous system activated because it's trying to right itself. And so this is where our good friend the thalamus gets involved, and that's why so many withdrawal symptoms are generated from thalamic nuclei. And so when you talk about somebody that's sweating or nausea or dilated pupils or yada, 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 you're dealing with a lot of areas that are innervated by the thalamus or thalamic nuclei. And so we know that as we are activating these reward pathways, behind the scenes there's a whole nother set of neuroanatomical structures that are hiding and waiting for this side over here to quit working so that they can kick back in and try to right the wrong that's been going on. And so it's not that this side says, okay, you guys have taken over, you do whatever. They're still operating in the background, but there's always a negative feedback loop. We talked about that before, to where if we're activating this particular nucleus over here, 9 times out of 10, that particular nucleus has a feedback loop to where this one's coming from and to all kinds of other places to tell them what's going on, so that we don't have everything firing all at one time. So we know that as we're activating that reward pathway, there are negative feedback loops for thalamus and locus coeruleus and some of the other areas of the brain. But whenever those substances of misuse are taken away, that negative feedback loop is removed and those areas start being activated once again. So you're going to see questions at some point, whether it be on the national board exam or even in this particular section of training. And their questions are going to involve patient presents as X. And you're going to have to decide, is it cocaine intoxication or opiate intoxication or opiate withdrawal or whatever it may be. And every one of those questions is going to contain a very telling piece of information. They are all going to have some description of the pupils. Okay? So you have to look at mydriasis versus meiosis. And where are the acutely intoxicated folks? Because you may see it in the emergency department if you're in the ER, or you can see it in urgent care, or they just may be somebody that got a little lit before they came into their primary care visit. But you're going to do in your comprehensive exam, you're going to do a pupillary exam and a light reflex exam. One thing that I want you to think about, so mydriasis versus meiosis, okay? Opiates and heroin will make your pupils small. Pretty well all of the other boys involved will make them big, okay? So I want you to think of that in the back of your brain. It doesn't, you would think that if somebody's, doped up on an opiate, that should be a central nervous system depressant. And why in the world are they getting meiosis? Because if I'm on a benzo, that's going to be a central nervous system depressant. Why are their pupils dilated? You guys get to go figure that out, okay? But really think about in your physical exam, mydriasis versus your pinpoint pupils versus dilated, so that it's going to be very telling. And I can guarantee you, you're going to see questions. And the first thing I want you to do is when you're looking at a substance use intoxication question, pick it apart. Where are the eyes? Bam. Okay, now what can I get rid of down here that doesn't make the eyes do that? Being a smart test taker. Okay? But that smart test taker means you've learned the information to know, oh, well, alcohol, I'm going to be here. Opiates, I'm going to be here. And so you just need to know that information. So when we withdraw, one thing that happens with the cessation of that chemical or substance that we may be using or misusing is that we have a big push in corticotropin releasing factor. And that corticotropin releasing factor's job is to then interact with several other neurochemical producers in the brain, which then cause physiological response that we see in withdrawal. So when corticotropin releasing factor is released in response to the cessation of the substance, we're going to see activation of things like the medulla, the amygdala, you're going to see pituitary activated, you're going to see locus coeruleus activated with sympathetic activation. So what's going to happen? Heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up, blood glucose goes up, folks are on edge, angst. So you're going to see very common things that happen in acute withdrawal situations. Now, is opiate withdrawal a life-threatening situation?
I think it can be.
Could be. Part and parcel, somebody's on 6 or 7 hydrocodone a day and they stop abruptly, do they need to be hospitalized? No, not an acute issue. They're going to feel bad, but not an acute issue. Alcohol withdrawal. Why is it an emergency? Why do they need to be monitored? Speak up.
Blood pressure drops.
Nope.
Is that on nutrition?
Nope. Seizure. Who said seizure?
Oh, yeah.
That's your primary thing. You've got to be abrupt withdrawal of alcohol. You've got to be worried about seizure. You know, you're going to have to deal with what alcohol, high dose, long term has done with their brain and Korsakoff's dementia and these kinds of things, and malnutrition, yes, and so forth. But the thing that you'll learn as you become a smarter test taker, you all are near experts in test taking, or you wouldn't be here. Everybody at this level has become an expert in test taking to some degree. But to get all the way through, you have to learn some tricks of the trade. And what you're going to learn is that every question that you're asked on every exam, you need to figure out what is the patient's priority, meaning how serious is this? Because there are some conditions that are far more serious than others, and you can't get distracted by somebody was in an automobile accident and their tibia and fibula look jacked up, but you miss the gear shift knob sticking out of their, you know, they got a flail chest or something. So you have to not get distracted with certain things, and you need to think first, what is the most dangerous thing that could be going on with this patient right now, and not miss very important things. And so alcohol withdrawal is one you've got to think of. Yes, there are other extraneous things that may go on, but the most serious thing, seizure. Benzodiazepine. Why is it a medical emergency for abrupt withdrawal? Or could be a medical emergency?
Respiratory suppression.
What was her answer?
Seizures.
Seizures. Yes. So alcohol and benzodiazepines both change our seizure threshold. Abrupt cessation of either of those chemicals in somebody who's been on moderate dose for some period of time or an increased risk of seizure. Okay? So what's happening then is, as we're there and at a set point with using those substances, the physiology of your brain has shifted. And once we withdraw those, these types of things happen. So now we're activating other parts of the brain, whether it be a large release of corticosteroid or sympathetic activation or whatever that may be, and we're at greater risk of certain conditioning happening. And you just got to remember, just tuck it away in the back of your brain, that benzodiazepines and alcohol, acute withdrawal, can be very dangerous And so in acute withdrawal situations, although I hate benzodiazepines, they do have a use. And in the emergency setting, you're going to treat an acute withdrawal patient that's acutely withdrawing from alcohol. Don't choose the answer that says IV ethanol, please. You're going to give them a benzodiazepine, and it's to prevent seizure.